Japan Station is made possible by listeners like Patricio. Patricio, thank you so much for joining the $3 a month plus alpha tier. I would just like to say, makoto ni arigatou gozaimasu. So if you would like to join Patricio and all the other wonderful patrons over there on Patreon, then head on over to japankyo.com/Patreon and sign up today. Welcome to Japan Station. I'm your host, Tony Vega. Okay, so just a quick note for new listeners. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and go ahead and check out the back catalog. I have over 40 episodes at this point, and I've covered all kinds of topics, plenty of topics related to Japanese pop culture like J-pop and anime and video games, but also other stuff like artisanal Japanese chicken and soba noodles and a bunch of other stuff. So go check that out. You can find more episodes at japanstationpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. So moving on. My guest today is Matt Alt. So there's a pretty good chance that you know who Matt is. He's been doing localization and translation for well over 20 years. For much of that time, he's been doing that together with his wife, Hiroko Yoda. Of course, they run the company AltJapan, but they've also published a bunch of really interesting books, including Yokai Attack, which is quite possibly one of the most well-known books on the topic of yokai, right? These folkloric Japanese creatures that is available in English. But Matt has a new book out, and that book is called Pure Invention, How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World. So we mainly talk about that book today, and it's all about things like Hello Kitty and Nintendo and anime and Sony Walkmans and a whole bunch of other stuff, and the impact they had on Western culture, especially in the United States. And you're going to get to hear me talk about the impact that kind of stuff had on me, and of course the connection that Matt has to all that kind of stuff. So I think you're going to enjoy this. It's a pretty fun conversation with a guy that I've been wanting to talk to for quite a long time. And actually, Penguin Random House reached out to me to said, hey, you want to talk to Matt and check out the book? And she's like, yeah, yeah, of course I do, because this is a guy that I've had on my list of guests that I want to talk to since before I even launched this podcast. So it was an absolute delight to get to talk to him. And if you want to pick up the book, then consider using the Amazon affiliate link for Japan Station and japankyo.com. You can just go to japankyo.com/Amazon or check out the link that I'm going to include in the show notes for this episode. That will send just a few pennies my way, and that will also prevent those pennies from going to Jeff Bezos. So if you want to stop him from getting rich in that way, you can do that. And it will also support Matt in this latest endeavor. So that's 3 birds, 1 stone right there. But anyway, let's get to it. Here's my conversation with Matt Alt.
The next stop is Japan Station. The doors on the right side will open.
First thing I wanted to ask you about was in the intro. I mean, of course, you've been doing localization for like 20 years. And
sure.
You mentioned how you've noticed a kind of transition. Well, okay, so you kind of say it 2 ways. First, you mentioned how it seems that Westerners are like thirsting for a more authentically Japanese feel, but then you kind of pose it a different way. So
Right.
could you explain, first of all, like how have you seen the demands on the localization front evolve over these past couple decades, and what do you think is the reason for that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, you know, when I first started getting into even learning Japanese in the 80s and 90s, there just wasn't very much material in translation that had been done by native speakers at all. It was mainly done by Japanese people in-house at the companies, and translation and localization was an afterthought. And that always really frustrated me because I thought the games were really well done, but the English often wasn't. You know, there's the famous all your base or belong to us,
Yes.
or in the old Nintendo games, the pro wrestling game, a winner is you. You know, there's just so many classic examples of fractured English. And I was always frustrated by that. And when I after graduating from college and after working for a few years as a professional translator doing technical translation, when my wife and I founded AltJapan in the late 90s, there weren't very many people at all on the planet who specialized in doing game localization full time. You probably could have counted them on two hands. And there wasn't very much attention paid to the localizations, and we often had to explain to game companies why it was important that they localize their products. Using native speakers instead of just, randomly assigning it to some person who had taken a couple English classes and happened to work inside their company.
Right.
But, that rapidly started changing in the early 2000s. Games started to come out at almost the exact same time as they came out in Japan and in the West, this kind of sim ship, as it's called now, where there used to be a huge lag, sometimes of years between when something came out in Japan and America.
Right.
And the kind of, there was a synchronization going on between the Western and the Japanese game markets. And, as part of that, we noticed that there were a lot of really vocal fans who were critiquing and demanding better localizations in games. And that was really interesting to us. And at first, it was easy to kind of see these people as just being otaku, as Japanese call them, like, diehard, overzealous, obsessive fans of something. But then I came to realize it wasn't really that at all. It was that we in the West had so synchronized to Japanese tastes that anything less than what the Japanese were being delivered felt like it wasn't enough anymore. And this great synchronization, I think, was actually driven by video games in a large way because we consumed so many of them over the course of the 80s and 90s. And, our sensibilities kind of came to synchronize with the people who were making the games. And I think that's why we started to see that so much. And so it's been a huge change. Now localization is a very visible part of the game development process. There's many companies out there. It's become almost a commodity. Where companies just bid the lowest, bid to get a job and they turn it around. There's all sorts of tools for doing it. It's very different from when Hiroko and I first started working, and it was just a completely analog, sometimes even writing on paper process.
Yeah, and I guess right around that time is really when the internet started exploding. So people could actually figure out on their own, oh, this is from Japan and something funky is going on here. And they can kind of do the detective work on their own too and realize okay, this was translated in a kind of strange way.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, when I was a kid growing up, and I was born in 1973. So, when I was growing up in the 80s, the only way to get information about stuff from Japan was going to some kind of sci-fi convention. And it wasn't even an anime convention. They didn't exist back then. You had to go to a Star Trek or a Doctor Who convention or something and hope that there was some guy in the back who was, selling bootleg anime videotapes or, magazines or something. The internet just obviously completely accelerated that process. And now you don't even have to leave your house to get the latest information or even the latest shows because they're streaming,
Yeah. So that was something that you kind of mentioned in the book as well, your own early exposure to Japanese culture and the language and studying the language early on. I thought that was really interesting in Massachusetts, how you just coincidentally had this very interesting person that was your teacher. And then that in its kind of indirect way led to Osamu Tezuka too, although that never ended up working out.
Yeah,
Can you explain that story?
Yeah. It was Maryland, actually. It's funny. People always...
Sorry, yeah.
No, not at all. It's funny. People always think I'm from Massachusetts. It's the funniest thing. You're not... And I have a lot of great friends in Massachusetts.
MA.
And Massachusetts actually, ironically, was one of the kind of hotbeds of anime fandom in the 80s because it was shown on local TV stations there. But I went to school in Maryland. That's where I grew up. And my teacher... I was very fortunate in that my high school offered one of the first... I think the first Japanese language program offered at a public high school in the continental U.S., which was, just huge for me because I was already into anime and stuff at the time. But, it seemed like a very distant dream to even go to Japan or have anything to do with it. So to have this class, in my high school was really great. And my teacher, her name was Jean Morden, was a former GHQ occupation forces individual. She had worked with the American government. She was a lieutenant in the Navy and helped translate documents and diaries and things taken from captured enemies, Japanese enemies during World War II. And she, after the war ended, immediately got in the first ship for Japan and started teaching Japanese to the occupation forces there. That was her job. And when I met her, obviously, it was much after that. She had retired from that and become a school teacher and was teaching this pilot Japanese program. And it was amazing. I mean, to have that opportunity, it was seen as so strange in the 80s to be for American kids to be wanting to learn Japanese. And I remember a couple of years before I started studying, the Washington Post actually, came and visited the class and wrote this, sort of wondrous article saying how Japanese, they actually use this words as one of the world's most difficult and least useful languages. And I was like, wow, man, way to dismiss an entire nation's tongue, But that's how it was back in the 80s, It was like Japan bashing. And, the adults were all really angry about Japanese cars and Japanese appliances disrupting American marketplaces. But, me and my friends, all we cared about was like Super Mario Brothers and Godzilla movies and Hello Kitty stuff and, playing music on our Walkmans. So it was like two different worlds had already started in parallel back then. And, my teacher, who was from that World War II background, was grown up, was from the old generation. And we kids learning Japanese were part of this like cutting edge of this new generation who saw Japan in just a totally different way.
Yeah. So then, could you briefly just explain that Osamu Tezuka thing that you almost might have met him had things not gone the way they did?
So Osamu Tezuka is, for those who might not know, he's known as like the god of manga in Japan. He's like the founding father of Japanese televised anime. And you might be familiar with his creation Astro Boy that was broadcast in the States in the 1960s. But he was just an absurdly prolific manga artist, and somehow he got word of our class existence. And one day when I was still a freshman in high school, I came to class, and like after class was over, sensei called me and a couple other friends over, and she's like, I want you to take a look at this. And these giant boxes were full to the brim of manga. It must have cost a fortune to mail it. And there was a letter on top, and she's like, who's this Osamu Tezuka guy? And we were just like, oh my God. And Tezuka had heard about our class and sent one copy each of every manga he'd ever done up to that point. This was like 1988 or something like that. So this is a lot of, it's basically his entire oeuvre of work.
Yeah.
And, my teacher had no idea who he was. She had, the Japan she knew was like a devastated, country. And, Tezuka's rise was in the 60s and 70s after she had left and come back to the States. Right. We knew who he was, and we were just like bowled over. We thought it was so great. And, we helped her shelve all of these manga in the classroom. And then, he also included in that note saying that he wanted to come visit. And, I'm like, please, Sensei, you really should let this guy visit. It'd be so amazing. Unfortunately, Tezuka, it turned out, was battling stomach cancer. And he lost his battle with that in 1989 before he was able to make a trip over. But, I still, have this regret that I came so close to meeting the master and never quite did. But it was, I still to this day remember how, touched, even as a jaded, irony drenched, 13 or 14-year-old, how touched I was that this guy on the other side of the ocean was supporting us with all of this, such cool stuff. And that's a really kind of formative moment for me.
I guess that just goes to show like how unique that class was, that somehow the information got to him, right?
Oh yeah. Well, the Crown Prince visited as well of Japan, like royalty visited, the current, like the guy who became the Emperor of Japan visited the class. And which is pretty wild when you think about it. But, to be brutally honest, as a manga obsessed 14-year-old, I was more excited by the prospect of Tezuka coming than actual royalty. I would
be too at that age. So.
Yeah, it was cool. It was amazing. But, of course, my hero wasn't the Crown Prince of Japan. My hero was the guy who invented like Astro Boy. That was my hero.
Something that you describe in the book, I think really, how can I put it? The way you lay it out to me made me think of my own experiences. So I was born in the 80s.
Okay.
Around what, like 10, 12 years after you?
Okay.
So I think that, I was exposed to Nintendo. I was very much into Nintendo and those, video games in the late 80s. And, cartoons here and there. Like, for example, you have the cartoons that were being animated in Japan, but they were American properties, or Transformers
Right.
based on, Japanese properties, but American story. And then I moved to Peru at the age of 10. And that's when I discovered Dragon Ball and Captain Tsubasa and Saint Seiya.
Man,
And I was
jealous.
watching that in Spanish.
I am so jealous because the Spanish-speaking world and the Italian-speaking world got.
Yes,
I mean,
French. Yeah.
Yes, French, but the Italians in particular are like they will not be defeated by Japanese otaku.
Definitely.
Like they saw everything in real time, just like the Japanese did, and are, if anything, even more obsessed with like 70s and 80s cartoons than Japanese. It's amazing to me. And as a kid, I kind of had heard about this, and I was like, man, why can't the English-speaking world get this many cool shows translated? So I'm jealous of you.
Well, see, my point is that I think by the time I got to Peru, I think I had already absorbed a lot of these things, like whether I was aware that Mario was originally from Japan and this and that, like that didn't really matter. Like I was already kind of exposed to this idea. And when I got to Peru and I really started to understand, like, oh, this thing in the credits has kanji. This is not from the US. This is from, it's from Japan. And then like things started coming together. So then when I went back to the US a couple of years later, by that point, anime was really starting to break into the mainstream, and you started getting things like Cowboy Bebop, and late 90s anime started to like go on Toonami and that kind of stuff. So I just couldn't help but think about the way the history kind of lined up with my own personal experiences.
I mean, I think you were right in the thick of it. And I call these things Japanese sensibilities, and when I say that, what I mean is, Super Mario is a perfect example. It's like it's a very cutting edge product because it's a video game, and it was better than any American video game for a home console in America at the time. And it's a very cool experience. It's fast, like you're running around, but it's also very cute. Like Super Mario is squashed. He's what we now know as kawaii. And like at the time when we were playing Super Mario Brothers, we didn't quite understand, we didn't know what the word kawaii meant, like Japanese style cute. But, Super Mario Brothers in particular showed us a style of game that could be cool and cute at the same time. And nothing like that really existed in the West. And stuff like that became a kind of counterpoint to the Western, this is a big word, hegemony of the pop cultural sphere. And it became this real alternative, something that we could turn to that was different than what we were raised on, and had kind of different values and sensibilities in a good way. So you were really in the thick of that if you're born in the 80s. We were kind of, for people born in the 70s, like it was just getting started. Like when the NES came out in America in 85, I was, already a preteen. But I know lots of people like you who are raised on it since birth. Like they don't know another video game system like it started on the Nintendo. That's a really, the Nintendo Entertainment System is what I call in the book a fantasy delivery device. It's just like a straight shot of Japanese tastes into the brain stems of kids all over the world.
Absolutely, yeah. Everything, like you said, the aesthetic. Also, I think the music in a lot of those games.
Yes.
I mean, like retro game music is still huge these days, right?
Well, one of the things I mean, like the craft that was put into it, like the seriousness with which like every person involved in those games approached their tasks was something that was evident to me even as a kid. And like you just couldn't see that craft as much in American games at the time, like the Atari 2600 stuff, because it just simply wasn't well developed enough. And of course, Americans were taking video games very seriously at the time, but there was just this artisanship to the Nintendo games and later the Sega games and later the PlayStation games that I encountered as a kid that really was different from American work.
Yeah. So it's clear that you did tons and tons of research for this book. I see, you mentioned specific biographies by name and people you interviewed. And in the end of the book, you have some acknowledgments and you mentioned some other people specifically by name that you interviewed, but didn't necessarily focus on too much within the book itself. What are some interesting people that you got to talk to, and what are some particularly memorable interviews that you had?
Wow. Well, I mean, the most memorable interview, of course, was meeting Mr. Negishi, who invented the world's first karaoke machine.
Yeah.
Meeting him in Tokyo was just a blast. He's 90 something years old, but still going strong, and was just a really funny, guy to talk to. A very witty guy and very, proud of his work. And to him, it was just like a side thing. He ran this company that basically assembled electronics for all sorts of other manufacturers in Japan. And this had been kind of a side thing for him. But and now at 90 years old, to see this young, to him, American guy coming in and being like, hey, tell me about this project from 40 years ago. You could tell it really gave him a charge. But yeah, I met so many interesting people. Another one is I got to speak at length over email with Susan Kerr, who is the ex-Apple employee who designed all of the Macintosh's UI, like the fonts and the icons and things like that. And she and I had a very long conversation about kind of the Japanese influences at at Apple when she was working there, because Steve Jobs was obsessed with Sony, and he was obsessed with Japanese design, and he and Susan actually used a Japanese woodblock print as the kind of default screen for the original Macintosh for all of the sales materials they were doing.
Really?
Yeah. So this really beautiful woodblock print of a woman combing her hair. So seeing, I'm really interested in that intersection of Japanese sensibilities and Western, hearts and minds. And Apple is really at the core of that. But I met so many great people in the process of working on this book. The gentleman who engineered the Nintendo Entertainment System, we spoke for many hours in Kyoto. He was just really a joy to talk to. The list goes on and on and on. I could just, do this all day. But meeting these people it was like a detective story. I had to track them down, and then, I had to interview them. And I just wanted to kind of lend my eyes and ears and linguistic abilities to readers. That was like my key thing,
Yeah. Was there anybody that was really a challenge to get, and then finally you were able to get that person?
Well, actually, one of the difficulties of doing a book like this is that when you are dealing with live IP, basically meaning intellectual property, meaning games and products that are still in print or still in circulation, companies really don't want to go on the record talking about them. There's no upside to them. So it was very, very, very difficult to convince anybody at Nintendo or Sanrio to talk to me. Fortunately, there was just an absolute mountain of material on almost every aspect of both of those companies in Japanese, including extensive interviews and memoirs and things like that have never been published in English. So for those situations, I was really fortunate to have that background material to use for writing the book. In other cases, I kind of what I call triangulated. I can't talk to Sony's Akio Morita anymore because he passed away in the 90s, but I was able to track down and talk to most of the surviving members of the Walkman design and development team. And so, through those overlapping stories, I was able to build a kind of, a vision of what had happened at Sony and what was going on when the Walkman came to be. So it wasn't as simple as just picking up the phone. Hey, I'm writing a book. You want to talk to me? Most people are busy. Most people don't want to talk. So that's just how it goes with any kind of project like this. And you have to make do with what you have. But I was very fortunate in that Japanese are meticulous documenters of their own cultural histories.
Yeah.
And so I was able to rely heavily on that and vintage, I'd go to the National Library here and just be pouring through old magazines and newspapers and stuff. And that was a big boon too.
Yeah, it's interesting that like now this specific timing. I guess you must have been working on this for the past like 4 or 5 years. It seems.
No. Actually, only the last like two and a half.
Oh, wow.
Really. It came together like it took me about a year to do the proposal, and that's something that actually shocks a lot of people. The proposal itself was like 200 pages long. That's how it is these days. You can't just turn in a paper saying, a single sheet saying, I'm going to write a book about this and expecting it in advance. So, after doing that, it was basically, that took about a year. And then from the moment I signed that contract, it was about a year and a half. And of that, basically a year solid of it was absurdly fast. I don't think I would ever agree to do it on that kind of deadline again. But we were trying to bring the book out in time for the Tokyo Olympics.
Sure.
Which, as we all know, didn't happen.
Sure. Yeah. But I think the book is like absolutely still relevant. I mean, regardless of the Olympics, it's It's just nice timing, but in the end, the message is still the same. Yeah.
And hopefully the Olympics will happen next year, and then that'll give people a chance to carry it with them when they come here. It's absolutely it's not linked to any the book actually ends in March of this year, so it's really up to the moment kind of stuff. So I wanted to do something that was both kind of a deep dive on history and kind of up to the moment and relevant, and that was kind of my guiding light.
Yeah. A quick question about the Sony archive. You went there, right? What is that like? How do you get access to that? Is that like some super secret facility or something?
No. Well, here's the problem. Okay, the problem is that Sony for many years ran this archive in Shinagawa, which is where most of their corporate offices are, and it's where Sony kind of got its start as a company. Back in the post-war era. And they had this amazing like open archive museum kind of thing. Unfortunately, it closed down about a year and a half ago. So now the archives are closed, and I had to just interact with them over phone and email and stuff like that. But I'm really hoping they reopen this archive. It was amazing. It was like this museum where they'd have like every Walkman displayed on a wall, every tape deck, every TV like just displayed, and it was really a cool place. And I'm glad I got to visit it before it closed down. But I don't think it's gone. I think it's going to come back.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, of course, they have their corporate archives, and those people were super generous and helpful to me. And I was really happy about that, because sometimes big companies can be really obstinate, and not really and stubborn and not want to talk at all.
Yeah. No, that's cool. Yeah, a lot of big Japanese companies have their own like little museums and archives that are actually accessible to people, and a lot of times they're even free, right?
Yeah, well, like Bandai, the big toy company in Asakusa, which is right by Sensoji Temple, which is one of Tokyo's major tourist attractions. Yeah, Bandai's headquarters, the entire first floor is like a museum of old and new products, and I think it's really cool that these companies do that kind of outreach. I think Japanese companies have been aware for a long time of what role they play in a kind of people's lifestyles. And so especially companies that specialize in fun stuff like tend to have more open sorts of displays in the kind of museum areas like that.
Yeah. Or like breweries.
Yeah, exactly. Like sake breweries and like Japanese distilleries. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, there's a lot of those. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask you specifically about one of the topics that you touch on the book, because you touch on many different areas, like you're saying video games, but also Hello Kitty. And one aspect of the Hello Kitty story that I found really interesting was its kind of link to this whole like 90s gyaru / like compensated dating and jokosai thing, and then how that kind of got spun into what Hello Kitty ended up becoming, this more like general wider appeal brand, right?
Yeah, so Hello Kitty was a really pioneering product in the 70s that kind of commodified cuteness and packaged like kind of cuteness and nurturing and mascots. And of course, there had been tons of Japanese mascots and cute characters before Hello Kitty, but Hello Kitty was the first that was kind of sold as a commodity in her own right. Like, she wasn't from a manga or an anime. She wasn't used as a mascot for like a bank or like some other organization. She was cute personified.
Yeah.
And Hello Kitty started out as a kind of decoration for selling things to little girls.
Right.
And that was it, pencils, notebooks, tote bags, all sorts of things that a little girl might want in her life. She just basically started as a decoration. But as those little girls came of age, you got to remember these are kids in the 70s and 80s using this. In the 90s, after the Japanese economic bubble burst and things got really kind of economically apocalyptic in Japan, very dark, like the future became very dark for Japanese people, especially young people who weren't sure if they'd even be able to land jobs because the economy was so bad. Young women started turning back to Hello Kitty as this kind of fondly remembered symbol of their childhoods, and kind of adopted her ironically as a sort of, unspoken symbol or code to show other girls, that their kind of tastes. And it became a kind of, Hello Kitty evolved from being this simple decoration into a communication tool. For building networks, for forging friendships and connections between girls. And so as that trend accelerated, she actually became this kind of ironic symbol of girl power. Like this is our symbol, this is our, we're going to be feminine and we're going to be proud of it kind of thing. And so that was part of the transition of Japanese kawaii from being a simple aesthetic into kind of an identity.
Right.
And that does overlap a little bit with, as you were saying, there was a big problem in the 90s with this compensated dating thing, which is in the West, we'd kind of call it a sugar daddy situation where, girls would agree to go on dates with older people in exchange for, expensive dinners or designer bags or, even just simply money. And, it's highly probable some of those situations did turn into something sexual. It's likely most of them weren't, but it was kind of squeaky and weird. And, Hello Kitty products were being used by a lot of the girls who did that kind of stuff. And so they became a little bit connected, I think, in the minds of people in Japan around that time period. But even today, Hello Kitty, I think, has emerged less. I think she's probably equally, if not more popular among adults than she is among toddlers, and that's an amazing transition for something that's just this simple illustration of a kitty cat. Even if she's not a kitty cat, she's actually a little girl. That was a big revelation from a couple years back.
Yeah, and she's three or five apples tall, I think. Exactly, I can't remember how many apples.
Exactly. I always get it mixed up with the Smurfs because they're like 3 apples high too. But I don't know if you remember, like 2 or 3 years ago, there was this big kind of scandal, so to speak, when Sanrio declared, she's not a cat. She's actually an anthropomorphic little girl. She's a personification of a cat. And like Western people were kind of like, what? What are you talking about? And it's in Japan where like mascot culture is so much more developed than it is in the West. It was instantly understood. Oh yeah. She's just she's a little girl. She's a cat personifying a little girl, or the vice versa. Like it's much easier for them to grasp.
I just learned about this like a couple weeks ago, but are you familiar with the cat character Tama? Like Uchi no Tama-chan Shirimasen ka, I think is the
it's actually, are you talking about it's actually a real life cat, like photos of a cat, or am I thinking is it Maru?
It's an anime.
Oh, okay. No,
it was
not
animated, and they did a reboot. They did a new series. It's a cat, white cat with a big head. Tama. I think it's Sanchome no Tama-chan. I think is the first part of the title. In 2020, they did a new animated series where it's all the characters are depicted as like cute boys, but in the concept of the story, they are still animals. It's just that to each other, they see themselves as boys, but to the humans see them as animals still. It's this like bizarre thing. Yeah.
And like, you have to, it's like Westerners are often like, that's so weird, man. But like when you think about it, like even in Disney lore, like, you have Goofy and you have Pluto, and like one of them is a dog and the other one is like a kind of human dog.
And like some wear pants and some don't, right?
Exactly. And so, this was part of like the movie Stand By Me. This was like a whole scene in that film is them debating like, if Pluto's a dog, what's Goofy? So like this kind of thing does exist in the West, but it's just so much more prevalent in Japan. And the Japanese designers take it so seriously. That kind of rigor with which Japanese mascot designers approach their work is something that I find it's very charming. They're very serious about it because A, it's serious business, and B, it actually it brightens up a lot of people's lives. It's important work.
Absolutely, yeah. One last thing relating to my own journey with all this stuff, but I was born in New York before I went to Peru, right? I was there until about like 10 years old. And I remember there was this store that I guess they sold like imported character goods. Maybe not exclusively Sanrio, but they had a lot of Hello Kitty type stuff there. And this was, I guess it must have been around 94 or 93. And I remember seeing Hello Kitty and thinking like, what the heck is this character? Where is it from? I was utterly puzzled. I didn't get it at all. And now, just after years of, just understanding what this is and being exposed to it, I just think Hello Kitty is Hello Kitty. And that's what it is.
Yeah, well, it's like, it's part of the background, noise of life these days. I'm a little different than you because we actually, in my area, our local shopping mall actually had a Sanrio gift gate in it. So in Virginia, Tyson's Corner Mall, it actually had a Sanrio shop in it. So even from when I was a little kid, I understood that there was this company called Sanrio who was selling all of these cute products. I don't know that I necessarily connected it to Japan so much at the time, because I was really young. This is even pre-teens kind of time period. But it was always there. And like Hello Kitty, I think, is this kind of standard by which everything else cute is judged. It's really amazing. And one of the actual key critical insights I took away from writing that chapter is that even Sanrio doesn't know what the magic is that makes her tick. Like they have no idea. And they've made so many awesome other characters, from, Bats Maru the Crow to like Gudetama and like right now Agretzko, the kind of red, the karaoke singing red panda office lady. I mean, they're great. So like, it's not like they've lost it, but they just, Hello Kitty is like in a league of her own, I don't know, but I mean, often when I like, how there's this whole like, it's less these days, but maybe like 5-10 years ago, there was a huge boom of Yurukyara, these like Japanese mascots. Like, I still think like a lot of them are kind of shooting for that general Sanrio vibe because that's just become like the kind of kawaii mascot like vibe that you're supposed to aim for, right? Yeah. I mean, she really set the tone. She's almost like a haiku. You can almost define her more by what she isn't than what she is. There's like only, how many lines does it take to draw Hello Kitty? Not many, So that kind of like simplicity, that kind of reductive simplicity, I think is also a big part of what gives Japanese design its charm because, Super Mario had to be designed the same way. They only had like a, 16 by 16 pixel matrix. You had to leave so much out, but even still, even as a kid, even hitting his original Donkey Kong variation, you can tell it's this dude wearing a hat with a mustache and like overalls. Like that's amazing that it's 16 by 16 matrix. That's literal digital haiku. So there is just so much more to this book. I highly recommend that people check it out. I have one last question for you that's kind of not related to this specifically, although indirectly I guess it is, but one of the ways in which I first learned about you is through your work with yokai. Of course, your book, Yokai Attack. And I think many people know you from that. How did you get into yokai and how did you decide, like, I'm going to be like the yokai guy when you published this book? I'll be honest with you that, my interest in yokai came entirely through Hiroko Yoda, who is my co-author on that book. She is, she's my wife and she's my, partner in so many things, running AltJapan and all sorts of things. And she is the one who was obsessed with Japanese ghost stories and yokai tales and things ever since her childhood. And she kind of introduced me into that world. And Yokai Attack came about when, she and I this must have been around 2005 or so. she was trying to explain certain aspects of it to me, and like we had picked up a bunch of Japanese books on like of ukiyo-e, like art of vintage yokai stuff, and there was nothing on it in English. There was literally not a single book out in English on this topic, and I was like, we were both like, what? Like, how can this possibly be? And that's where we came up with the idea to pitch a book that explained yokai. Which you couldn't even use the word yokai back then.
Right, yeah.
Which is why the book is subtitled The Japanese Monster Survival Guide, even though I think monster is kind of a very blunt tool for explaining what yokai are.
Right.
And so, you know, we pitched it and Kodansha International picked it up and you know, we had a really great editor, Greg Starr, who turned it into this, the book that it became. But yeah, Hiroko has always been my guide to the world of the Japanese, like, spooky ness. And she is just a walking dictionary of old Japanese folk tales and
that's
stories
awesome.
like that. Yeah. So that was very much, you know, I love it. It's huge. It's a huge part of our, you know, creative lives, but she was really the driving factor on that. And it was so much fun to do all of those books. We did the yokai, we did a ninja one, and we did the yurei, the ghost one.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So like, I mean, back when you wrote that book, I mean, yokai, like you said, the yokai was not yokai. But nowadays, with a lot of people, like, for example, you have Yokai Watch. Yokai is yokai. So
yeah. And you see people just using it like in regular publications and things like that now. Like, you know, you can just use that word. And part of that is, you know, I'd love to take some credit for that, but it's also, I think, mainly due to the fact of the internet and how quickly, you know, information spreads and how savvy young people are, especially Japanese fans, about things related to Japanese culture. Like they just, you know, it fit a need. Yokai fit a need to explain in English something that we didn't have a word for, which are these kind of folkloric monsters versus Godzilla type monsters, or like, you know, vampire type monsters, you know, or Frankenstein type monsters. Yeah. So, I mean, it's very, you see that I think Hiroko in my dream is to see the word yokai in like the Oxford English Dictionary.
Hey, little by little,
it'll happen.
It's going that way. I mean, like, you know, the interesting, I guess the convenient thing, maybe, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but because video games, because anime, because manga have generally like this kind of lore to them, and fans get really passionate about it and they want to investigate more and more and more. When they see some mysterious creature, they want to find out, what is this? I want to remember the name of this, right? And they get very serious about it.
I think like a big key to why Japanese pop culture in particular is so popular is because Japanese producers are so bad at promoting themselves that like you have to put in the effort to kind of explore and find more. And it becomes a kind of adventure in a way that like in the West, where like, you know, PR efforts are honed to this like almost subliminal level where you can't even escape it. That's not the case. That's not the case for especially things like, you know, anime, where, you know, the production companies, the studios are so busy making the next anime, they barely have any like bandwidth to promote their products. You know what I mean? So everything that you watch feels like kind of a discovery. And I think that mirrors how probably people like you and me felt when we found our first, you know, Nintendo games, or when I first picked up a Walkman, or things like that.
Or like fan subs or something, you know?
Exactly. And so I really wanted, in Pure Invention, I really wanted to kind of bring that sense of discovery back and put it into a narrative form. It makes it like, it makes you kind of take ownership of it, right? Like if you really want to get it, you got to do the work yourself. Right, exactly. And that's why I think things from Japan so often form into parts of people's identities, you know, because they had to put that effort in, and maybe they're the only ones who around themselves who understand it.
Yeah. Well, it definitely was a lot harder to find other people into it like 20, 30 years ago.
These
days it's easier.
Aside from my like little group of friends in high school, like 2 or 3 of us, like I don't think I ever met another Japanese pop culture fan in my entire 4 years of college. You know, like people thought it was kind of cool if you showed it to them, but there weren't like otaku. You know what I mean? Like there are now. Now I hear like every person studying Japanese at the high school or collegiate level is basically doing it because they love anime or they love manga or they love whatever. When I was studying, like me and a couple friends were the only ones into it for that. Everybody else was because they wanted to use it in business when they grew up or something like that. Or they were into martial arts or calligraphy or something. And now that's completely flipped.
Yeah.
So,
it's fun stuff, and it's a great way to learn Japanese if you're. I mean, I saw an interview that you did quite a while ago, I think, about on tofugu.com.
Oh,
and you were talking about, localization and translation and some of those issues, but one of the important messages that you highlight in that is that if you're really passionate about, not losing anything in translation, got to learn the language. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it's the only, if you are so obsessed with purity in your content that you get angry at the people who are spending a lot of time translating it or localizing it, you really should channel that energy into learning the language, because you'll be happier.
Yeah, definitely.
You'll definitely be more satisfied and happier, and you'll have a new skill, So that's what I was trying to say in that interview. And
I mean, I don't know if I was frustrated, but I definitely felt that I wanted to understand it without a go-between, like something in the middle, right? I wanted to understand exactly what was being said, and now I can, and I'm very happy that I can. Yes. Well, translators often take it on the chin for, because they're the most available target. We lash out at the people closest to us, and if you're consuming Japanese content, the translator is obviously a lot closer to you than the director is. But, it's a business. Selling anime and manga is a business, and so a lot of the decisions that get made and a lot of the things translators and localizers have to do are basically out of their hands. It's orders from on high. And, that's just how it works. Yep. All right. So Matt has tons and tons of stuff which people should check out. But of course, the latest book is Pure Invention. And I will include links in the show notes and all that kind of stuff, and your Twitter and all that. So thank you so much, Matt, for chatting. It was an absolute pleasure, and I enjoyed the book.
Thank you. I thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Once again, here's a little shameless self-promotion, but if you want to support the show and get the book, Pure Invention, then consider using the affiliate link, japankyo.com/Amazon, or check it out in the show notes, japanstationpodcast.com. Okay, so in case you're curious about that show that we were talking about the cat called Tama, and in the show they were portrayed as boys, but to each other they still see themselves as animals. So the proper title of that show is Uchi Tama, Uchi no Tama shirimasen ka? And if you want to check out the trailer, then go over to the show notes at japanstationpodcast.com. I found one on YouTube, and I will include it there. I will embed it so you can enjoy those beautiful boys that are actually animals. All right, so if you have any Japan-related announcements or any interesting things you want to let me know about, feel free to email me, mail@japanstationpodcast.com. Make sure to follow on Facebook or Twitter @JapanKyo News. I do update both regularly. And of course, remember to subscribe, rate, review, tell a friend, do all that stuff. That does help the show out. And thank you to Unomi for providing the theme song for Japan Station. More information in the show notes, japanstationpodcast.com. And that does it for episode 44. Episode 45 is in the works, and I am about to do an interview with this really, really, really interesting guy who's originally from Japan, but is doing stand-up comedy in Canada. And wow, he seems to have had a really interesting life. So I will be doing that interview probably the day before this episode goes up. So come back on August 15th for that. Just a reminder, I almost always release 2 episodes a month, one on the 1st of the month and one on the 15th of the month. All right. And if that's not enough for you, then make sure to check out Ichimon Japan, my other podcast. You can just go to japankyo.com/ichimonjapan. That is more Japan-related content, and sometimes we get a bit sillier over there, but we cover a lot of interesting topics, such as in the latest one, we talk about telling time with animals and this ox-based curse that is quite well known in Japan. So go check that out. I will include a link in the show notes. So thank you for listening, and remember, go find your miniature pony.
Just do it!